Ricardo had already closed the door to the house for the last time, but the feeling of closure hadn't hit him yet. It wasn't enough to simply separate from Clara. No, he needed to go further. With the divorce papers signed, he sold half of the house where they had built years of life together. To him, it was a calculated move, a way to mark his exit, to show Clara that she no longer controlled his story. The silence in the living room seemed to scream his absence, but the truth is, Clara had expected something like this all along. The smile on Ricardo's face when he handed her the contract for the sale of half the house was no surprise. It was just another stab. Clara looked at the house, once a refuge of love and hope, now divided. It was a symbol of everything that had been taken from her, not just materially, but emotionally too. The walls seemed to close in, and the emptiness of each room echoed her loneliness. Yet there was something in her that Ricardo hadn't anticipated, something he had underestimated. Clara wouldn't crumble easily. It wasn't the first time she had faced abandonment, and it wouldn't be the last time she would rise again. The cold wooden floor she once loved now felt different under her feet. Reality, harsh and inevitable, embraced her, but instead of weakness, she found strength. With a sigh, Clara stood up from the couch. If Ricardo thought she would stay there, trapped in her pain, he was gravely mistaken. His abandonment, the cruel act of selling half the house, would be the fuel that ignited something within her that he would never be able to extinguish. The days following Ricardo's abandonment were filled with uncomfortable silences and moments of disorientation for Clara. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt like a battleground. Half of the things were gone. Furniture, pictures, even the small details that made the place a home had been ripped away. Ricardo hadn't just taken what was his by right. He left deep scars in the structure of the house and in Clara's heart. Mornings were the hardest. Clara still woke up early as she always had, but the absence of Ricardo at the breakfast table left a palpable void. The empty chair across from her seemed to personify everything she had lost. It was strange how something as simple as silence could scream so loudly. But Clara wasn't going to let it destroy her. She knew she needed a plan, something to pull her out of the shock and get her moving. She started with routine, trying to bring some sense of normalcy to what remained. She tidied the rooms, reorganized what was still intact. But with every step, she was confronted by the reality that this was no longer the same house. The wall where a picture of the two of them used to hang was now bare, and the space beside the sofa where Ricardo's favorite lamp once stood felt like a gaping, unavoidable void. It wasn't just the house that was incomplete. Her own life felt fractured. The finances, something she never had to deal with on her own before, now became a constant concern. Selling half the house meant that soon someone new would be there, invading the space that once belonged solely to her and Ricardo. But at least the money from the sale gave Clara some breathing room. She knew she needed to rebuild herself, but how? The doubt gnawed at her, yet deep down, there was also a spark of hope. If Ricardo thought she would fall apart, he was wrong. Ricardo returned to the house with a smug smile on his face. He had planned this from the start, selling half the house, abandoning her, leaving her alone so that eventually Clara would come to him, begging for help. He could almost picture the moment, imagining Clara, helpless, fragile on her knees. As he walked through the door, he had already rehearsed the words he would use to push her down even further. But as he opened the door and stepped into what was once his home, Ricardo was met with something he hadn't expected. There stood Clara, in the center of the living room, with a posture so firm he barely recognized her. Her eyes no longer overflowed with sadness, but with a determination that made him stop in his tracks. "You came back?" Clara asked, her voice calm but heavy with meaning. Ricardo, still in shock at what he saw, tried to regain his air of superiority. "I thought you'd already be begging for me to come back, that you'd have realized the mistake you made letting me go." Clara laughed, but it wasn't the laugh he knew, the one they used to share during carefree nights. It was a cold laugh, full of irony. "Oh, I realized something, Ricardo. I realized the mistake of thinking I needed you to be happy." Ricardo's face twisted into a mix of surprise and anger. He looked around expecting to find signs of chaos, of a life falling apart. But what he saw was an organized home, though incomplete. There was no despair there, no traces of a woman who needed him. Instead, there was strength. "You can't be serious. How are you doing so well?" he asked, unable to hide the frustration in his voice. Clara took a step forward, lifting her chin. "I rebuilt myself, Ricardo, and now you're no longer part of that." Her words cut through the air like a sharp blade. Ricardo, unable to control his anger, felt the control slipping from his grasp. After that confrontation with Ricardo, Clara felt something different. The sense of freedom was palpable. Now, the house, once divided and incomplete, became the stage for her rebuilding. The first step was simple, but symbolic: buying back the half of the house he had sold. It was more than just a financial transaction. It was a declaration of independence. The days that followed were dedicated to transforming that space. Clara decided that every corner of the house should reflect her new reality, her new self. The walls were painted in vibrant colors, and the furniture, once chosen by Ricardo, was replaced with pieces that resonated with her essence. She wanted everything to carry her mark. Every physical change was a reflection of her internal growth. Throughout this process, Clara wasn't alone. Friends, who once seemed distant, drew closer. Messages of support started to pour in, and invitations to lunches and coffee dates multiplied. Even her family, who for so long had seen her only as Ricardo's wife, now saw her differently. They saw Clara, strong, independent, resilient, and for the first time, she felt that way too. She spent her weekends reorganizing the house, but also reorganizing her life. Small victories, like hanging a painting or planting a new garden, were celebrated with a smile. There was something therapeutic about the manual labor, as if each nail she hammered was a way of rebuilding what had been broken inside. Clara now looked around and saw not just a house, but a home she was building with her own hands. And with that, her confidence grew, her determination solidified. Ricardo, who once exuded arrogance and control, now found himself trapped in a maze of his own choices. Months had passed since he had returned to humiliate Clara, and nothing had gone the way he had imagined. Instead of finding her fragile and defeated, he found her stronger and more determined. It disarmed him. He, who had always believed in the power he held over her, now felt the bitterness of failure. His finances, once solid, began to crumble. The business he thought was infallible was affected by poorly thought-out decisions, by the arrogance that had blinded him to the opportunities before him. Little by little, his business partners distanced themselves, and Ricardo realized that the fortune he had accumulated was slipping through his fingers. With each financial setback, his pride took a hit. He tried convincing himself that it was just a phase, but with each new failure, reality struck harder. What hurt him most, though, was seeing Clara, the woman he thought would be begging for his help, thriving. He saw her from a distance, hearing stories of how she had reclaimed the house and how her life was moving forward. What irritated him the most was her indifference. Clara didn't look back. She didn't care to know about him. Her absence, her silence, it hurt more than any words could. Ricardo began losing control over his own life, and his wounded ego caused him to fall even faster. Now, without money, without the respect of others, and above all, without the confidence he had always had in himself, he began to sink. Clara, who he once thought would be the focus of his revenge, was now the reflection of what he could never be: resilient and victorious. Ricardo could no longer hide his frustration. The idea that he could somehow destroy Clara consumed him. It was as if he were in an emotional prison, and the key was in her hands. He planned one final visit, believing that this time he would settle the score. It was a desperate attempt to regain the control he felt he had lost. He arrived at the house, now vibrant and full of life, and his heart raced as he saw how Clara had transformed the space. The walls, once oppressive, were now decorated with bright colors and photos of friends laughing and celebrating. It was a home, something he had never valued, but now it looked like a fortress. He knocked on the door, his mind racing with words of contempt. When Clara opened the door, her expression was one of surprise, but there was no trace of fear. Confidence radiated from her, like a shield against any attack. "Ricardo," she said in a neutral tone, but her eyes sent a clear message. She no longer feared him. He began to spew his venomous words, trying to hurt her, but as he spoke, he realized his anger was fading. Clara interrupted him, firm and determined. "Enough, Ricardo, I don't need you anymore. Look at me, I've moved on. What are you even doing here?" Silence settled between them. Her words echoed in his mind, reminding him of what he once had but never valued. He stood there, confused, grappling with the reality around him. What used to be a battle for power had turned into a search for validation. Ricardo had expected a confrontation, but instead he was met with a simple truth. Clara was no longer his. She had freed herself, and that left him lost. In the solitude of his own home, Ricardo couldn't escape the incessant replay of the recent events in his mind. The encounter with Clara had been a painful revelation. He slumped on the couch, his mind a battlefield between frustration and reflection. The walls, once witnesses to his pride and his determination to seek revenge, now seemed to whisper to him, questioning his motives. He remembered how meticulously he had planned each step of his revenge. Every insult, every visit to the home they once shared was calculated. But what had he really achieved? The image of Clara, strong and confident, now haunted his psyche. What was meant to be a moment of triumph had turned into a mirror reflecting his own fragility. His memories of Clara, once tied to love and passion, were now tangled with deep bitterness. He found himself questioning his beliefs about power and control. What did it really mean to win? He had lost what truly mattered, and in its place there was a growing sense of confusion. He had always thought strength lay in dominance, in having total control over others. But now all that remained was emptiness, an echo of what he had lost. Ricardo stood and walked to the window, watching the world outside. People passed by, happy, carefree. He wondered if real strength lay in being vulnerable, in accepting the changes life brings. It was a distressing dilemma. How could someone who had always sought power now find himself stripped of everything that once supported him? The idea of power was unraveling before his eyes, and with it, he began to understand the depth of the loneliness he had created for himself. Clara looked around her home, now filled with new colors and furniture that reflected her renewed personality. Every detail she had chosen told a story of resilience and growth. What once was a symbol of pain and abandonment had transformed into a sanctuary of strength and hope. She smiled as she thought about the journey that had brought her to this point. The rebirth she was experiencing wasn't just physical, it was deeply emotional. With sunlight streaming through the windows, Clara felt the vibrant energy of the space. She remembered the sleepless nights and the tears shed, but now each memory was a building block in the foundation of her new life. Each day, she rose stronger, more determined. In her professional life, projects started to flow. New opportunities emerged, and her confidence grew with each achievement. The old fear of failure had been replaced with the certainty that she could rise again after any fall. But the transformation wasn't just in her work. In her personal life, Clara began to connect with people who inspired and supported her. The bonds she forged with friends and family deepened, based on mutual respect and love. She rediscovered what truly mattered, not possessions or power, but shared experiences and meaningful moments. As she prepared dinner for her friends, Clara smiled at how much she had changed. The woman who once felt helpless was now filled with self-love and gratitude. She knew that real power wasn't about controlling others, but in rising up and refusing to be defined by adversity. As she looked at the decorated table, she realized she was ready to celebrate not just what she had accomplished, but who she had become. Ricardo sat at his desk, his face lit only by the soft glow of the lamp while his hands trembled slightly on the cold surface. He stared at the reflection of the man he had become, a man lost in his own traps. The memories of Clara, now so distant, pounded in his mind like waves against a worn shoreline. For so long he had fed off anger and the desire for revenge, believing those emotions made him strong. But in truth, They had only left him weaker and more isolated. The visit to his old home made Ricardo realize that Clara was no longer the fragile woman he had imagined. She had transformed, thriving in his absence. Instead of feeling triumphant over his presence, he felt like an intruder in a world that no longer belonged to him. His anger gave way to a new feeling: acceptance. He realized that Clara had won the battle, but more importantly, he had lost the war against himself. With a deep sigh, Ricardo picked up his phone and deleted Clara's number from his contact list. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of a new decision. He no longer wanted to live in the shadow of a past that had consumed him. His life needed a new purpose. With a clearer mind, he began to think about what he truly wanted. What were the dreams he had set aside while focusing on destroying his ex-wife's life? Ricardo decided it was time for a radical change. Instead of seeking revenge, he would embark on a journey of self-discovery. He enrolled in a photography course, something he had always wanted to explore. Through the lens, he hoped to find a new perspective, not just on the world around him, but also on who he truly was. This new journey, far from the shadows of the past, began to seem more promising than he had ever imagined. Clara looked out the window of her home, now full of life and color. The walls that once echoed memories of pain and disillusionment now reflected her rebirth. She had transformed every corner, every room, into a space that told the story of her overcoming. The flowers in the garden, with their vibrant colors, were a testament to her resilience. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, bringing warmth that seemed to embrace her, as if the universe was congratulating her for finally finding peace. With a smile on her face, Clara began to plan a new chapter in her life. The wounds of the past had healed, and she was ready to start fresh. She decided to open a small interior decorating business, something she had always dreamed of doing. Each project would be a new adventure, a new challenge, and she was excited to bring beauty and joy to people's lives. Clara felt confident, as if she had finally found her true voice. Meanwhile, Ricardo was undergoing his own transformation. He was learning to live without the weight of the revenge that had consumed him for so long. His photography classes opened his mind to a new world. Each image captured through the lens was an opportunity to see the subtle details of life he had once overlooked. The shadows of his old life began to fade, and he felt that at last he was allowing himself to be vulnerable. Ricardo realized that his journey wasn't just about moving away from Clara, but about getting closer to himself. With each click of the camera, he rediscovered the small beauties of the world, and slowly began to understand that true strength didn't come from control or revenge, but from the ability to adapt and grow. Both Clara and Ricardo were finally ready for the new beginnings that awaited them, each on their own journey, yet both united by the transformations they had undergone. What would you do in Clara's place? Would you have moved on with your life, or would you have welcomed Ricardo back home? Comment below what you would do, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so you don't miss any stories like this.